All right, good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started this morning. Let's start off with a word of prayer, and then we'll get going on this. Jim, would you open us with a word of prayer, please? Thank you.
Lord, we're thankful for this time and opportunity to be able to gather here today. Ask you to be with us in this study. We ask that you help us to be able to better understand your word so we can better apply it to our lives. This is our prayer in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen. Okay, Romans chapter 15, lesson 15, chapter 15, lesson, I got this. Romans 13, lesson 15. It says lesson 15, and all of a sudden I just threw myself around. Romans chapter 13, lesson 15. And picking up with question 3 here. We saw some things from question 2 about Paul talking about the significance of Christians being in subjection to civil government, governing authorities. And now we're going to see here with question 3 a little bit more about this and to the types of government that God has specified. So, does God determine a specific type of government? What do you think about that? No?
Nope. To be civil.
Okay.
Civil government. What's that?
Okay. Yeah. Mark?
Well, he determines the government of the church, of his church.
Okay.
And so, I mean, that's what ours is supposed to be mirrored off of our Constitution. So that, how that is set up, not completely, but mirrors it.
So a government within his kingdom,
Yeah.
type of a thing. Yeah. Okay.
So God's government is an autocracy. He's in charge of everything. If you look through any biblical times, democracy did not exist.
It didn't.
It didn't. There was no democracy. It was one person in charge, and God is in charge. It's not a democracy.
Yeah. So has God ever allowed democracy?
Well, obviously, we're it was a democracy.
No.
Republican.
Senate.
It's
It's run by the Senate, but it happened. But eventually, but they tried to.
You had to put out leaders first, and then it moved to more of an autocracy.
Yeah, so there have been throughout history different forms of government, haven't there? And there currently exists in the world today different kinds of government. What would you say are sort of the reigning or the top authorities or government styles of government, types of government that exist in the world currently? What's that? Okay, so dictatorship. So I wasn't asking you to talk about the United States specifically. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Isn't that what we hear being thrown around, right?
Yeah.
Fascism and all this kind of stuff, right? So dictatorship, and what is that basically? How does that work?
I think that's the other side. I think that's the devil working on that side. Both leadership, because you got Putin and you got that guy from Korea that just won his election 99.1, fraction of a percent. He claimed himself victorious leader. Some of these guys, you see, you kind of think that Satan's pulling their chain, but I think God's keeping them in control. Otherwise, we'd have a nuclear. I'm just wondering who's going to pull the big bomb here coming up. You know what I mean? It's getting to that stage. We've been saying it ever since we were kids, hiding under our desk in the 60s. We used to have to hide under our desk and stuff or stuff like that. But you kind of wonder how some of these guys are in power and, God's keeping them at bay because we haven't had that big nuclear problem yet, which I hope we don't because it'd be sad for our world.
Yeah, you just keep waiting for World War III, don't you?
Yeah, you got thinking.
So dictatorship is that? Does that go ahead?
Well, yeah, dictatorship, you can have monarchs.
Yep.
Uh,
How are those different?
huh?
A monarchy and a dictatorship. How are those different?
Well, a dictatorship is usually a one rule or one family rule, and monarchies, although one family rules,
One party.
it's also a democracy. They have a democracy type of government, but a monarchy is in charge of family, it's in charge like the queen.
Okay.
But still, autocracy is still the prevailing rule in the world. Takes up about one third,
Okay.
or one third of the world, like China, Korea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do we have a monarchy or do we have a democracy or a republic or what do we have?
Yes.
Democratic or something.
We have a republic democracy.
A republic democracy.
Yeah, it's called. So it's
Yeah.
a democracy, but it's ruled by the people, or governed by the people.
Okay. So what's the difference between a republic and a democracy?
Democracy is 50% plus one.
Okay.
Okay, a republic is up at 75%.
Okay.
We have representatives.
So where we have sort of the differences that exist between republics and democracies and all that kind of stuff, ultimately it's supposed to be about what? That the idea of either is really about what do they have in common in the idea of
Democracy is mob rule. A republic is watching out for the small guy.
okay. So ultimately the people rule. That's what's in common, made differ in the idea of how that's accomplished. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the government is set up to assist the people, right? To provide for the people as the government's supposed to do. So when you have a king, if you have a good king, life is good. If you have a bad king, maybe not so good.
And therein was the struggle of Rome, right? It was do we have a Caesar, a king, or do we have senators who are representative of the people, and the senators are basically running the nation? And that was kind of the struggle in the pool, wasn't that, within Roman rule? And it's kind of the struggle that even seems to exist today. What was going on yesterday in the news and in the world or in our nation? No King's Day, right? No kings. And we don't want kings here. That's the whole thing behind that.
They were
Now,
successful.
what's that?
They were very successful.
Yeah, we have no king. Yeah.
Yeah. Because even the president, whether you agree or disagree with how the president, whoever's president at the time, how they're operating, they still are limited, are they not?
Mhm.
Right? There are checks and balances in our system that they're limited to what they can do. And then, of course, it's the concern of that some people have of, well, they're getting away with doing more than what they should. Therefore, they're lording it over, or the president, is lording it over the people, right? And we know Jesus talks about that. Us as Christians, we are not to lord things over other people, but there's an authority that we abide by and live by, and an authority that we promote. What authority is that? Okay, in promoting God's authority, how much should we promote earthly authority?
We obey because by that we are also obeying God.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, take a look over at Acts 4. So there are two things. Acts 4, and Walt brought this up last week, but I want us to see a prevailing principle here, because we're asking the question of, does God determine a specific type of government? Why or why not? And so what would you, before we read this, but what would you say is the authority that God determines the specific type, if there is any? And clearly he allows different types. Would you agree with that? He allows different types of governing authority to exist. Does he work through those?
Yes.
Based off of what type of authority then does he cause those to operate? If they're different, how can you have differing authorities and all of them be from God?
Well,
Because Paul's saying here that the authorities that do exist, they are from God. So how can there be different types of authorities and that be considered as being from God? What are we gonna say, Jim?
well, I was gonna say that the different types of civil leaderships in the world don't necessarily all conflict with God's law. You can have multiple different types of governments that conform to God's law.
Right. Ultimately, what Paul has issued out is that there is no authority except from God. Therefore, whose authority is the ultimate authority? It is God's, right? And so anyone who's operating by any authority operates by it because God has set that authority, that rule in place. What rule is it of God then that is set in place? What did he do in the beginning? What rule is it that's of him? Well, we can talk about the Ten Commandments, what guides, what is the rule behind how we should live. We could talk about Ten Commandments. We could talk about, well, we try and determine, well, Old Covenant, New Covenant, but the things that were going on in the Old Covenant that God laid out, the Ten Commandments, and then all of the sub rules, his ordinances, his testimonies, right? All of those things, they were for what purpose? To help the judgments for the people of how they should live, right? In fact, when Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount would say, "You've heard that it was said, but I say to you, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth," right there, he is quoting God's law, right? He's quoting God's law. You've heard that it was said, but I say to you. Now, that's a statement of authority, is it not? Is he even rising up over the authority of God by saying, yeah, you've heard eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth? That's the law. But now I'm coming in and saying something. Is all of a sudden, is he overriding the law of God?
He is God.
He is God, number one. But he's not overriding the law. He's overriding what? Their implementation of it. Their misunderstanding of how that should have been applied. And so when you look at the rule, so there are three different places. There's Exodus 21, there's Leviticus, there's Deuteronomy, three different places where it uses that rule, that law of eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And when you go on and you read through that, the question is, and it includes a number of other scenarios in which here's where you mete out justice when something is wrong done, then retribution needs to be met out, or justice needs to be met out. And there are a couple different ways that something can be done that's wrong. So, like, you murder somebody, but you don't actually intend to do it. You kill somebody because an axe head flies off your axe. You're out there in the woods with your buddy, and that's what's given as an example in the law. You're out there with your buddy in the woods, and you're swinging an axe, and the axe head goes flying off, and it hits your friend, and it kills your friend. Then you have to go to the city of refuge. God made a place for you to go, and so that you could remain there for what? What was the purpose of going to the city of refuge? Yeah.
To secure legal counsel to sue the person that made the axe.
That's it. Secure legal counsel to sue the person who made the accident. Yeah. And then come to find out you're the one who made the accident. So now it's a problem.
Yeah, you were there until a high priest died in the city, I think.
Yeah. Justice was to be met out by you being able to go there. Someone's pursuing your life, a family member of the person you just killed because you swung the axe, right? All this stuff. The laws were in place. Who gets to mete out that eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, life for life? Now, shouldn't that person have to die because they took, whether it was accident or not, they took the life of this person, and I'm mad about it because that person was my brother, and you killed my brother. And I don't know all the details that went on there. You say it was accident, but I think it was intentional, and it needs to be life for life. And I'm going to hunt you down and make that happen. Well, this is what the laws were for. You see, the law of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, life for life was not for what? Not for individual personal vengeance to be met out. Who gets to mete that law out? Who gets to administer the justice of that law?
Avenger of the blood.
The what?
The avenger of the blood.
They get to be the judge and the ruler in that and to determine that the person's guilty? The avenger does?
They get to go kill the other person.
After what point? They just get to go, well, I'm going to go kill that person.
I don't remember reading anything about there being any kind of a trial.
Yeah. So when you read through like more of the law and see more of the details behind it, in fact, Jethro, who was Moses's what father-in-law, he gave some advice to Moses, right? Remember what that advice was? You need help judging the people. In fact, Moses was the one who was commissioned by God to mete out judgments upon the people based off of the law, right? But then Moses is feeling overwhelmed. And Jethro advises him, you need to appoint who?
A court system.
A court system where they're going to judge on the smaller things. And you're going to have these elders and these tribe leaders, and they already have people in place who are sort of, rulers over their tribes and over their families. All that stuff's already in place. But now they're appointed by Moses to mete out some of the smaller judgments and the more difficult ones then would be brought to him to make judgments on. So the point being, we mete out this justice by virtue of what? I just determined that you did something wrong, and I'm going to go ahead and mete out justice right here. Man, you've managed to injure the eye of this person I'm really close with, and so I get to injure your eye as a result. Eye for eye. What Jesus is bringing out is that people have taken a step beyond governing authority to take and enact vengeance for self. And this is what Paul's addressing here, that we have something in place, that the governing authorities have been put in place for what purpose? What's he saying in Romans 13? For good and evil, for punishing the evildoer and for rewarding or helping and protecting those who do good. That's his ultimate point and argument. What happens when a godless government like Rome decides to enact authority to punish evildoers, but then a few years after Paul writes this, those supposed evildoers, those accused evildoers are Christians? Right? That's what they were accused of, being wrongdoers. They would eventually, by Roman citizens, they would end up being accused of being actually godless, that they would be atheists, basically, because they didn't believe in the gods of Rome. And they were actively promoting against the gods of Rome. And to believe in something called Jesus, someone called Jesus and a resurrection. And so there were other things. They were accused of incest because they called one another brother and sister. So Rome has these accusations and calling Christians evildoers. eventually. Now, what do? Here's governing authority saying you're guilty, you belong either in prison or you deserve to be burned at the stake, and you deserve to be crucified, you deserve whatever, to be thrown to the animals, the lions, you deserve to be used for sport and killed. What happens when governing authorities seem to be enacting justice, but it's really not justice? So what then? What do we do?
You gotta define justice.
Okay.
Everybody has their own definition.
Okay. So how do we define justice?
Depends on your situation a lot of times, quite honestly.
Justice is defined in the Bible.
Okay, so ultimately we're under God's justice system.
Yeah.
And with that, he says, so be subject to the governing authorities. How far?
Until they cross God's word.
Okay, here's Acts 4 and 5 now. Here's our biblical example. Two of the apostles, Peter and John, are arrested for what purpose? What was going on? They were doing wrong things, so they must have been doing wrong things because they were arrested. Something about innocent until proven guilty, right? And thankfully, we have that as part of what really makes for freedom and justice for all in our country. That notion. But Dennis, you said something. What'd you say just a moment ago?
They're healing a lame man. Heal a lame man.
So they not only heal a lame man, but they also claim to do it in the name of Jesus, and they are preaching and teaching in the temple about Jesus, and they don't like it. Who's they? Who's the they? It's the chief priests, the priests who would have been really been the Sadducees in this picture, but then also Pharisees would have been part of this. But the council, the actual council, the court system of the Jews consisted of the priesthood at this point here. And so that's why going before the high priest was significant, and why when Jesus is brought before the high priest and all of that, he's brought into their court system. Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount would say, hey, watch out how you deal with things, lest you be brought before the court system and you be found guilty and you're thrown in jail and all that kind of stuff. Even Jesus understands, look, there's a system, a justice system, but right now, these individuals have arrested Peter and John for speaking the name of Jesus and teaching about him and his resurrection. They don't like it. They believe Jesus was blasphemous, that he was not who he said he was. They're still sticking with that story. They want them to shut up about this. And how does Peter respond to all this? Chapter 4, verse 19. But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge. Now that's interesting. What are they supposed to be judges over right now?
Themselves.
Over what authority is really authority, right? In other words, they've called them out on, are you stepping up of your own authority and your own reasoning for why you've arrested us? Or are you actually operating off of God's authority? So now they've called into question the way that they are administering authority that they are supposed to be operating by. These are the governing authorities. Now, and he continues on in verse 20. He says, for we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. Why? Why can't they? Shouldn't they just go ahead and listen to them?
They're compelled.
Why are they compelled? I just have this fire burning within me.
Yes.
They were given specific direction by Jesus. Go and preach about me to all the nations. And I'm going to warn you, there are going to be people who are going to try and shut you up. They're going to imprison you, but don't worry about what to say when you need to say it. I'm going to help you with that, right? So they were given specific commission by Jesus to speak about him. And now we have others trying to tell him, don't. Governing authorities try to tell him to shut up, tell them to shut up about it. And so, what do they do to get them to shut up about it? Do they listen to them and go, "Oh, we think you're right. We've been operating off the wrong authority." No, they still see themselves as operating off of authority. Do they think they're operating in God's terms?
Who they?
The Sadducees, the Sad. They may say that they are. I mean, ultimately, that's their reason behind their decision making. Well, hey, this is why Jesus was put to death on the cross in the first place, was because he claimed to be king but wasn't. He also claimed to be God but wasn't. It was blasphemy. It was against the law. Those were the claims, right? So this is what, when wrongful govern, or when government does against God's word, against what he says, then what? Chapter 5, verse 29. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. And that's where the line is drawn, right? So as to the government, the type of government that God establishes, can we exist under any type of earthly government? Should we exist under any type of government? What if you were in Venezuela? What if you were in Iran? What if you're in Russia? What if you're in these places that have a very, very different feel than what we're used to in a government? What if you're here and existing under this government? How do you feel? I'm not asking for hands right now. Rhetorical question. How do you feel about living in this state and the different authorities that you're under here? Okay, how about that compared to other states? Would you rather be under a governorship under a different state versus this state? I mean, all of this to say we know how we feel about being under the authority of some people, and we think, thankfully, election time will come up and I'll get to vote. Hopefully, it'll go the way that I want it to. Isn't that how we do it? Hopefully, it'll go the way I want it to. But what happens when someone doesn't get all of the votes in the way that puts the person you think is the more godly choice? What happens when that person doesn't end up in authority?
Tough tacos.
What's that?
Tough tacos.
Tough tacos. I don't like to eat tough tacos, but so is it God's appointment or is it not God's
It
appointment?
is God's.
Okay. Whether we like them or not, they are still there serving in a capacity of ultimately good and evil. Does it always go that way? No. What are those who call evil good and good evil? Now we have that problem in place. This is where these guys are. Once the line has been crossed of switching around as to whose authority is more important, man's versus God's. Now we find ourselves in a place of going, look, I've always got to be following what God says. How do I do that and still respect and submit to the governing authorities? Should I be the kind of person who rises up against? Were John and Peter rising up against?
Well, it depends on whose side of the coin you're on, but the Jews weren't. So the Jews' authority was tolerated by the Roman government, and they could beat out punishment up to a certain level, but they couldn't defend anybody to death without the approval from government. So
Yeah.
They weren't the ultimate authority. They
Yeah.
were the authority over the Jewish people. They were not the authority over non-Jewish people, over Romans. But Rome tolerated that.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't think that they were out preaching to stand up to the Jewish people and rebel against them. That was not their intent. Their intent was to fulfill the commission. and happened to cross what the Jewish leaders wanted. So I think there's a difference in doing what God has asked you to do and then purposely trying to rebel. I'm doing it because it's in their face.
Yeah.
It's different.
Yes.
So I don't think they went and intentionally, okay, this will get up. They'll be upset about this. I don't think they did that. They had opportunity to do good by healing the man. They don't care what day it was. And then preaching Jesus' name, which was what their purpose is. God told them to do it. So as long as they're following God, which is their key, and their ruler, if it crosses mankind, who cares?
And to do it and speak for them to speak in the name of Jesus peaceably, right? Do you see them out there going, now let me tell you guys, that Roman government, even the Sadducees and the Pharisees, let me tell you all about them and the problems here versus what did Jesus speak out against the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Well,
So the question becomes, what example is being used when Peter said we ought to obey God rather than men? And also in Acts 4. What was the example? The example was they told me couldn't preach Jesus, but they did.
Yeah.
Can you see? Do you find any other example? Do you find any other example that says in the Bible that says you can overthrow? That you can rebel? What is it that we say? We only speak where the Bible speaks.
Yeah.
So what scriptures in the Bible? What scriptures show us where we can rebel other than not preaching?
Yeah, that's a good question and a good point to be made about really ultimately what, and I think Maeve also spoke to it, like what are we trying to be about? Are we trying to be stick it to the man and in your face kind of a thing, or are we simply trying to obey God rather than man in humble, peaceable ways? Right? Isn't there that difference? Isn't that what Jesus calls us to? Is that the people who in his Sermon on the Mount, that those who are kingdom dwellers are people who are peaceable, right? So how do you have peace when others are making it a difficulty? How do Peter and John have, promote peace or go about this in peaceable ways? Do you hear them getting, I guess, sort of angry and yelling at these guys and really like coming at them hard? No, they're just simply letting them know God's ultimately the one we've got to follow. And here's what we're going to do as a result of. They even tell them what they're going to do, right? This is what we're going to do. We're going to keep on doing it. And we're not going to stop because this really is of God. Go ahead, Maeve.
I think the closest example we could find is in the time of COVID, where we were told by the government we could not gather to worship. And of course, we are told by God that we are to gather and worship. So what we did is we found a workaround, thankfully to the Shapers, that let us worship in the open air, which was the level hall on their property. We found a workaround. We didn't protest and stand in front of the building and let all powers that be know, oh, we're worshiping anyway. That would have been wrong.
Yeah.
But we found a workaround so that we could fulfill what we need to do for God, despite what the government rules were put upon us.
And yeah, I think that's a great example. Those were some difficult times, were they not? Like trying to determine, like, well, what authority, what rule, what authority they have to make this mandate, right? And there was even the questions of, well, is a mandate, is that the same as like a law? Is that what kind of authority? We were starting to ask, what kind of authority does anyone have to do this? Well, whatever, it's happening, right? It's happening. So how do we deal with it? Ultimately, what Paul says here is, listen, if you don't want to be counted as an evildoer and I guess you could say justice met out on you or you dealt with as an evildoer, how How should you deal with it? Do good, is what he says. Be someone who does good. Well, what is good? The things that aren't against the law. Well, now, and this is the whole thing. It's like, do I like the law? That's not the thing here that's in question, whether you like it or whether you don't. But if you're a pursuer of doing good, and this is why he goes into this next section of stuff about making sure to be someone who does good, who's a keeper of the law, and a keeper of the law is someone who does what? What does he say in Romans 13? Someone who fulfills all of the law, all of what is good from God. What kind of person is that? Someone who loves his neighbor. Someone who acts out of love for his neighbor. Isn't that going to be pretty obvious and readily apparent if someone's acting out of the goodness of somebody else? Isn't that the thing that's perhaps the clearest for any and all people to be able to see? Is it misunderstood along the way? Sure. Yeah, some people are going to try and simply spin it because they have an agenda. So there's that. But ultimately, this is what Peter is bringing us to, even in First Peter, where he says, listen, people are going to try and slander you. They're going to try and malign you. They're going to try and speak evil things. You know, almost like that happened to Jesus or something too. And Jesus still did good, which was why we have his example. Even though he was still persecuted for all the stuff that he did, he was killed for all of the good that he did. And remember, he even asked the questions, for what good deed do you stone me? Right? And he calls them out on it so they can see it for themselves. He challenges them on it. For what good deed do you stone me? Do you want to stone me? And then ultimately, in all of his doing of right and good, he still ends up being killed. The justice system enacted injustice. Some just simply washed their hands of it. Pilate, right? He decided to take a step back from making the hard decision of doing what is just and right. And others insisted on the injustice, thinking they were in the right. And Jesus ended up dying for it. How many of God's people have suffered injustice? How many people who are not God's people have suffered injustice in this life? How many claim to have suffered injustice, but that's not really the case? You see, a lot of it comes from our own perspective, but ultimately, Paul urges, listen, as people who are Christ followers, be a doer of what is good, and you won't have to fret and worry. If anything, for conscience sake, he says, you can know I've done what is right, and I can live with myself, and I can live right, knowing that I'm right before God. That's ultimately the impetus that he's making here. Go ahead. Well,
I think Jesus stated the principle when
Yeah.
they came and tried to catch him with taxes. And he said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render unto God the things that are God's.
Yep.
That's the principle we should live by.
and ultimately, what is being issued out is a fundamental principle that God has of respect for what it truly is authority, right? Respect for authority, ultimately the authority of God. Because without that respect for authority, how does life go?
Yeah.
It's absolute chaos. It's absolute chaos. Well, so we've actually already answered question 4, that are there any circumstances where it's proper to resist civil authorities? So we've addressed that. Hey, look at that, we covered 2 questions today. I'm hopeful that we'll get to the remainder of this next week. So we'll start off with question 5. What does subjection to governing authorities involve? And we've already tackled a number of things here, but we'll look at a few of these texts and see what those have to say about it, and then get into the remainder of the chapter. So, all right. Thank you, everyone.